Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Bit of Medicine podcast. I am your host, Koku. We are reading a paper tonight called Rethinking Development, an Indigenous African Communal Approach. And I chose this because I think we really got to start talking more about community. I see people say that unity is overrated. I don't. What I will say to that is that separate, we don't have the ability to carry out the works that need to be done. So we have to unite. There's no way it can be overrated if one man can't do it. Listen, if I could have done it by myself, it would have been done already. If Malcolm X could have done it by himself, it would have been done already. So we really got to go back and look at community. We have to look at a communal approach to solving our problems. So this is what we're talking about today. I want to just hop on real quick, let you guys know what the discussion is about. We're going to start the show in a few seconds. In the meantime, make sure to check out all the other shows on KWAZ Radio. And make sure to check out my Thursday show on the KWAZ Radio YouTube channel. I have a show that I do exclusively over there. Check it out. It's called the Thursday Thoughts Show. It's a shorter show, and it's where I give my thought on a particular topic. So make sure you guys are subscribed. Make sure you guys are tuning in over there. Let's start the show now so we can get into the paper for tonight.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. So here we are, reading a paper called Rethinking Development, an Indigenous African Communal Approach. The idea, I could bet the gist of the conversation here is going to be about we can't use Eurocentric tricks and tips to solve African problems. We got to get back fully to our African selves. And that includes the Africans in the West as well. You got to get back to your African selves. You don't want to be Pan-African. Good luck to you. But at least get back to your African self. There's some solutions in there. If you can get back to your indigenous, traditional African selves, and good luck to you. Let's get right into the paper, shall we? Let's get right into the paper. So, Rethinking Development, an Indigenous African Communal Approach by AHMED Ali ILMI. Over the past 50 years or so, the term development in Africa has been synonymous with modernization, human rights, and democracy. In fact, the term development from a Eurocentric paradigm has been contextualized as a catch-22 phrase, encompassing all the programs and initiatives fashioned to move Africa forward. While it is important to address some of the issues on the ground, it is also important to question the asymmetrical power relation in which development advocates have been advancing for generations now when it comes to affairs in Africa. This chapter attempts to elucidate principles of development that are rooted in indigenous ontology, epistemology, and axiology to advance some of the key actions Africans need to take to control their development agenda. With this undertaking, I delineate the power of an indigenously anchored approach to transformative African-centered development. I examine how notions of African communalism have been instrumental in sustaining communities and development possibilities for Africa. I conclude this chapter by exploring the implication of an indigenous African approach to grassroots development. So, as you can tell, this paper is really a chapter from a book. As I started thinking about writing this chapter on development, one image that easily came to mind is of some young boys whom I briefly met in Mombasa, Kenya last summer. These boys had handcrafted, magnificent battery-operated toys from scrap metal, wood, and neon lights. It was remarkable seeing these boys intently playing with their toys. I remember noticing them from a distance and then quickly walking closer to watch them carefully as they played with their self-made toys. As an African from Somalia, I had known that boys usually make their play toys themselves, and I was impressed with the handiwork of these young boys. I even inquired about how these machines worked, a query they gladly answered. After gaining their approval to take pictures, I took a few photos of their toys to show to my friends in Canada when I returned. These boys' stories reveal the ingenuity of Africans to use local resources for their development needs. But these stories reveal a real tragedy. What will happen to these boys' creativity and ingenuity when they grow up? Will the education system in Kenya nurture these qualities to produce excellent engineers who are ready to build African-made cars? Or will they be added to the list of casualties of African intellectuals whose creativity and indigeneity to utilize local resources for their development needs are sacrificed on the altar of colonized European education in Africa? How can the education system in Africa be restructured to harness the intellectual creativity of African learners? As a proud African of Somali ancestry, I see the promise of the human capital, the engineering, the technological innovation, and the local indigenous African tradition that all went into producing these toys. Without such creative drive, these boys could not have produced such objects. The reality is that no true human development happens in a vacuum, and that there are social, cultural, environmental, and spiritual dimensions that must be brought to the forefront when discussing development in an African context. Development in Africa should not be seen as an abstract cultural capital, but instead as an embodiment of certain key values which make up African identities. How are questions in African development steeped in colonial relations? Development to serve those interests for how long? What has Western-centered development done to Africa? How are notions of knowledge production about Africa implicated in negating indigenous knowledges? Who is articulating, disseminating, and validating the development agendas of Africa, and for what purpose? Where is the location of African cultures in the everyday struggles of the people? Where are the places and what are the roles of Africans in redefining development to suit local needs and initiatives? These questions are not meant to accuse the West of any conspiracy or bad intentions to mislead Africa toward a wrong development agenda. However, this unquestioned Western-inspired top-down development model in Africa cannot be allowed to continue in the future, and destinies of these young boys in Mombasa, Kenya, are to be saved and protected from Western adulteration. Western colonized education has caused so many casualties for African intellectuals that it's time it stopped. Perhaps Sadar, in 1999, was not far from the truth in his observation that the actual issue of development is the definitional power the West has over the subject. As Ajay and Dai in 2008 astutely observed, this is a blurb here. The truth is that every culture and society recognizes the need to modify their surviving strategies to accommodate and deal with a new and emerging challenge within their environment. Where community members recognize their limited skills in surviving a new and emerging problem within the environment, they simply relocate themselves. This explains the rationale behind many migrations that occurred in the past in many parts of the world. Thus, for one society, the West, to claim a universal knowledge on surviving skills and insist that their surviving knowledge is the ultimate and indispensable strategy for all society in spite of cultural and environmental differences is not only culturally racist, but also an imperial agenda to dominate the world. So here's what I have to say about what we've read so far. It is ridiculous that this very same author would say that, a few paragraphs ahead, would say that he's not accusing the West of sabotage, right? But then you include this, you include this paragraph, this quotable from these two writers in a previous paper or book that does just that, which is accuse the West accurately of being racist and having an agenda to dominate the world. How do you have an agenda to dominate the world, right, if it's not intentional, if it doesn't involve sabotaging everyone else? Greetings, Bobby. You're right in the chat. Good to see you here, brother. Right? Greetings to Bobby. You're right in the chat. Make sure you guys hit the like button. I know there's only a few people here today. Hit the like button. Most appreciated if you hit the like button. Right? The learning curve is here as well. That's the revolutionary matron. She says, greetings. They can have their chronology, but we need our analysis. Their diplomatic policy demonstrates that they have an agenda, and it does not include Black power. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, so that cop-out by the author is the kind of thing I don't like to see in writings of, for topics like these. To then only come back and quote someone else or some other persons who nail it right on the head and tell you, yeah, it's an agenda. It's devised that way. To continue, for Paul Ajay and George Dai, there is a real problem when the West claimed or assigned themselves discursive power and authorial control over the definition of development. Even more troubling is when this Western narrow definition of development masquerades as a universal definition of development. Moreover, colonialism, through its psycho-cultural, civilizing logic, has contributed immensely to how development is viewed in an African context. It appears that any logic or discussion of development in Africa that does not have a Western imprimatur will surely die even before it reaches the policy files of our so-called African development experts and partners from the West. Within this context, any fruitful discussion about a new African-centered development paradigm must be rooted in anti-colonial and indigenous discursive praxis. Anti-colonial and indigenous discursive praxis question a Western-centered approach to African development. They call for development agendas that are rooted in indigenous African cultures, philosophies, worldviews, and values. Let me read that sentence. I like that sentence. Let me read it again. They call for development agendas that are rooted in indigenous African cultures, philosophies, worldviews, and values. African cultures, philosophies, worldviews, and values. These frameworks are not against development paradigms that borrowed from other cultural knowledges or experience. In fact, these frameworks work on the assumption that knowledge is a shared process, and therefore it is in order for an African development paradigm to learn and borrow from the West. However, these frameworks insist that such processes of learning and borrowing from the West must be based on African terms and self-autonomy, and are driven only by IMF and World Bank remedies for Africa. Again, these frameworks warn that while knowledge sharing and borrowing is a welcome approach, it should not be done at the expense of local knowledge and resources. In fact, Western patterns of development in Africa that insist every single resource must be taken from the West when it is obvious that Africans sometimes have the same resources in abundance is an indictment even for the most vociferous defender of Western development. So he came back and several times African intellectuals have been humiliated when they were forced to listen and serve under Western so-called development experts, who sometimes are nothing more than first-degree graduates in economics or international development. Yet these so-called experts earn salaries that far exceed those paid to local counterparts who are more qualified. For anti-colonial and indigenous discursive praxis, unless development is read within the lens of local initiatives, it is nothing more than pseudo-colonialism. What then is an indigenous African development paradigm? The answer lies in the next section. So he comes back to say, to call this thing pseudo-colonialism. Well, if you're going to call something pseudo-colonialism, then you understand the detriment that is on Africans. You understand the detriment that is on Africans. So what are you talking about? You're not saying that the West is sabotaging Africa. Like Mr. Untouchable, who's in the chat right now. Greetings, Mr. Untouchable. What say you? Mr. Untouchable says to the matron, he's throwing stones and hiding his hand. Let me go back up and read some of the other quotes. Mr. Untouchable said, respect everyone. Africa cannot wear a European jacket. It never fits right. I like that. Africa cannot wear a European jacket. It never fits right. The learning curve says, sounds kind of cowardly to quote someone saying something you want to say. And that's it right there. That's it right there. Then Mr. Untouchable said to the matron, he's throwing stones and hiding his hand. And then the matron says, yes, he is. I talk about the betrayal that we, the people, experience. KW7 is here. Y'all say what's up to KW7 saying Sawabona. The learning curve says, but we that know at times betray ourselves. Right? So peace to everyone who's here today. Make sure you guys hit the like button for me. I appreciate that. And I hope that these discussions, again, I hope that they could continue in the comments. I hope that they continue in your own circles with your people who are African-centered, Afrocentric, what have you, along those lines. I hope those conversations continue, But there was something he said here that I wanted to touch on, but it was in the middle of the paragraph. Oh, yeah. My question to you guys is, how do you feel about borrowing ideas from the West, or borrowing ideas from the people who would be your oppressor? I personally believe that if it's a good idea, it's a good idea. I don't care who it comes from. But what say you guys? Do you guys feel the same way? Do you feel like if it's a good idea, it's a good idea? If it solves a problem, it solves a problem. How do you guys feel about it? Let's continue to the next section while you guys who are live with me answer that. We're going to move to the section called Conceptualizing Indigenous African Development Approaches. Conceptualizing Indigenous African Development Approaches. This should be good. One of the outstanding myths with respect to Africa is that the continent is devoid of any participatory grassroots efforts and local initiatives. It is important to understand how this narrative operates within the humanitarian mindset. Day and Simmons in 2009 in their essay, The Indigenous as a Site of Decolonizing Knowledge for Conventional Development and the Link with Education, The African Case, warn us that recognizing the epistemological vanguard that guides and continues to inform the development project, immanent in the discursivity of development is the dominant Eurocentric epistemological traditions which form a disciplinary specificity inherent in the Western context. This is written funny. In Rethinking Development, one of the challenges is coming with strategies that work to introduce, affirm, reinscribe knowledges which have been positioned outside the limits of the system of knowledge production that governs quote-unquote truth regimes. In the words of Day and Simmons, indigenous African philosophies are a way of socializing community members into the select ways in which community members learn about ways to manage and interact with their social and ecological environments and struggle to maintain their way of life for future generations. Moreover, these philosophies are operationalized as social, political, and environmental engines to better the collective well-being of society. Such traditions constitute collective African identities that are rooted in the historical past. Indigenous African values are not static. In fact, they provide avenues for Africans to address contemporary problems. That's good to know. Indigenous African values exemplify African humanity, and they represent sacred relations or relationships to the Creator, to the land, to the community, and to a way of life. Day, in 1994, explains the African humanist as a value system speaks to the importance of relating to rather than mastery over nature and environment. That's an important point. Let me read that again. The African humanist as a value system speaks to the importance of relating to rather than mastery over nature and the environment. Right? You know what comes to my mind when I read that line there? You watch these white boys and white girls. You watch them go out here and kill a giraffe as if giraffes are some kind of animal that's attacking people. Right? Just go and blow away a giraffe. Right? Whereas African folks ain't troubling no giraffes. And I know that may sound kind of jokey, but I'm dead serious about that. You know, they want to show mastery over nature and the environment, whereas African folks more so want to relate to it. You know, many indigenous African cultural traditions emphasize and reward individual sensibilities and social consciousness. Read that again. Many indigenous African cultural traditions emphasize and reward individual sensibilities and social consciousness. The indigenous African civilization was not simply a matter of technological advancement. It is one of social responsibility, and such knowledge can be used to empower all. These is categorization of indigenous knowledges provides an entry point to discussing questions of African development and the power of African value systems for the people, because he highlights the essence of humanity and the importance of social relations within the African context. Moshe, in 2000, offers the following aspects of indigenous knowledges. Indigenous African knowledge is an intrinsic unity between the individual and the community. In their everyday lives, indigenous Africans try to strike a balance between one's collective identity as a member of a society and one's personal identity as a unique individual. This consciousness helps indigenous people to continually struggle against rugged individualism, shout out to the matron, on the one hand, and communism, loss of individual identity and rights, to the other. Let me read that sentence again. I threw a shout out there to the matron. This consciousness helps indigenous people to continually struggle against rugged individualism on the one hand, and communism, which is the loss of individual identity and rights, on the other. To avoid these two dangers, African societies strive to understand and define a person in the context of community. That in turn is understood and definable through its unique members. How do you guys feel about that statement right there, about consciousness, about how this consciousness helps indigenous people to continually struggle against rugged individualism on the one hand, and communism, loss of individual identity and rights, on the other? You guys let me know down in the comment section or in the chat if you're here live with me right now. The theorist recognizes the essence of community and individuals which make up the collective. African philosophical and social thought explicate that each person possesses special expertise, talents, and knowledges that could only be recognized if utilized for the greater good of the collective. This is a point I was trying to make some years back in the show, that you can't have a system. You can't go the communism route, because with the communism route, you're telling me that if I'm smart and I'm productive, and in fact, extra productive, you're telling me, like Oni would say from the pro-black perspective, that I get a biscuit at the end of the day for my ingenuity. You know what I mean? Like you can't have that. And at the same time, you can't go all the way to the opposite side where I'm dealing in this rugged individualism, which is basically, fuck all y'all type stuff. You can't do it, right? We are African people. We're somewhere in between, Morally, indigenous knowledges serve as a self-cultivating principle that offer a platform for a community to call upon and to work together in the spirit of community building. According to African worldviews, the community is a living organism of interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent, holistic social relations. I like that. This is what Pan-Africanism should be, right? Each aspect of life is interconnected succinctly. Everything needs to be in tune and to function in harmony and balance, enabling the community to be together eternally. That's according to Mbidi, John Mbidi. Within the community, Africans are encouraged profoundly to revere and engage in community affairs holistically. More important, all natural resources must be looked after, protected, and conserved for future generations. This is what W.E.B is talking about. Military. To protect, you have to be able to stand up against the forces that oppose you, right? Thus, before resources are consumed within African societies, there is the offering of the blessings and prayers and the giving of sacrifice to ensure greater harmony. Now, I'll be honest with y'all, I could do without some of that right there, and more with firm, sensible acts of protection. But for those who want to engage in it, have at. Indigenous knowledges stress that all virtues of life are living holistically and they are integral to the universe. Indeed, African knowledge systems emphasize the sacredness of spiritual interconnection to the earth and discourage a consumeristic relationship with nature. From a development sense, the question is, how do Africans shed some light on notions of collectivity in African society? And more important, how do we work with some cultural philosophies to engage with local development projects? What possibilities do indigenous African development approaches offer to Africans? The next section discusses these questions, and the next section is called African Cultures and Development. Let me check in with the chat real quick. If you guys are enjoying the paper so far, please drop a 1. Let me know that this was a worthwhile find. Drop a 1 if you enjoy the paper. Mr. Untouchable said a good idea has no color, but we must ensure that the good idea is universal, not just locally good. I agree with that absolutely. That's a wonderful That's a wonderful statement there. Yes, a good idea has no color, but you have to make sure that it's not just a local good, but a universal good for all the people. The learning curve says we can review their information, but we must analyze it. There are many solutions that are offered, but do not fit an African world view. That's absolutely correct. And like me and the matron have talked about before, we have elders who have given us blueprints, who have given us sage wisdom and advice. And the fact of the matter is we spend a lot of time shitting on that advice. We have had advice that we never really acted on. And so we got to go from a talking people to a doing people. Start talking about it and intellectual masturbation and all this old stupid stuff. We got to start doing some things. If it fails, it failed. We try again. But this is what we gotta inspire in our youth coming up too. The passion for trying, right? The learning curve says additionally, they stole all the best African ideas, then told you everything African is trash. That's a fact too. That's an absolute fact too. Like there's this weird factoid I'm going to throw out here, right? But this brother spots the mark on Great House on Twitter. He put out this factoid about 2 years ago, I think at the start of the pandemic or something, where like if you've ever been to New York in particular, or I imagine it's the same with Amtrak or whatever, wherever else there's trains in the States, there's a certain fixed distance between the rails on a railroad track, and lo and behold, that distance is they got that from Egypt, where the Egyptians worked out that if you're going to pull a chariot, the chariot wheels have to be optimally a particular distance. I think it's 8 feet and some inches, or 6 feet and some inches. Right? But they got that. And that's the standard that they use for train tracks. In fact, not just in America, actually, in the world. But then they'll tell us nothing we did made any sense. Oh, of course, they'll try to say Egypt is in the Middle East or some shit like that, right? W.E.B Rice says, I think Africa definitely needs to learn the Western military technology in order to defend itself if it ever unites against foreign imperialism. Absolutely. Right? He said consciousness is very important. The learning curve says collectivism, communalism is the African way, and it does not benefit us to have our identity outside of the group. We live because of each other, and that's what I'm talking about. That rugged individualism is nonsense. Right? And that communism is nonsense too, right? Mr. Untouchable says, steal the idea and take all the credit. LOL, just gangsters. Yeah, these guys are thugs, man. These guys are absolute thugs, Let me continue. We're at the point in the paper called African Cultures and Development. I see I got some ones from the learning curve, Bobby, right, Mr. Untouchable. So that makes me feel good about the selection of the paper today. Right. And again, if you guys ever want these papers from me, just hit me on the Discord. I'll post the paper. I'll DM you the papers, no problem. And if you want to continue the conversation afterwards, after the show goes live on YouTube, post some questions or comments in the comment section, and we'll continue our discussion. Bobby Wright is one of those guys familiar with posting comments and us having interactions in the comment section. African cultures and development. Ever since the era of independence in Africa, the one overarching question that many Africans, both on the continent and within the diaspora, have preoccupied themselves with is how do Africans harness their local resources towards their development needs? So you'll hear Only talk about this a lot, actually. Of importance are the enormous governmental resources, human capital, and projects which have been undertaken in Africa in the name of development. KWAZ, I might be butchering that name, 2011, in his paper Culture, the Missing Link in Development Planning in Africa. That sounds like a good paper, actually. Let me highlight that. He indicates the notion of development implies the improvement and uplifting of the quality of life of people, that they are able to, a large measure, to attain their potential, build and acquire self-confidence, and manage to live lives of reasonable accomplishment and dignity. This is a quote. This is quite a noble task if one is to extrapolate development in Africa from what is simply stated on paper. But the reality on the ground speaks to different social, political, and economical, colonial or neo-colonial relations that need to be interrogated in Africa. We need to move away from what African economist Claude Ake in 1996, in his book Democracy and Development in Africa, deemed a false, uncultured approach that lacks true development. Along the same line of argument, PRA suggests for development in Africa to have any success, it would need to, quote, to be premised on the cultural fund embedded in the social life of Africans, end of quote. In agreement with this idea, I strongly believe that we need a culturally anchored African approach to development, and by that I mean seeing African culture as a resource base for local projects, rooting development processes in African modes of thought and applying relevant skills to implement the intuitive and situating these efforts in the community, as opposed to the Western-centered, top-down, governmental, or not-for-profits way of conducting development. In Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his book Moving the Center, The Struggle for Cultural Freedoms, maps out ways in which culture can resist domination. Quote, culture carries values, ethical, moral, and aesthetics by which people conceptualize or see themselves and their place in history and the universe. These values are the basis of society's consciousness and outlook, the whole area of a society's makeup. It is identity. So, one of the things, I mentioned the pro-Black perspective talks about this thing about the resources, right? And one of the things he says is like coltan, for example, in the Congo, is just dirt to people in the Congo. And I get that. What I don't get is it was just dirt 60, 70 years ago. Maybe 80 years ago, 100 years ago, it was just dirt. Shout out to Patrice Lumumba, who's the anniversary, I think, of his passing, of his assassination, recently went by. Right? The thing is, though, there's a point where, and this goes to this notion of you can get your ideas from anywhere, right? There's a point where you have to realize that dirt, that thing that you looked at as just dirt, has value. And you can't let people come and extract it for very little in return. You got to grow a pair of balls. And I've talked about this before, even with my own hometown, when they found oil offshore some years back. And my government struck a deal for every dollar made, the government gets 12 cents. The oil is in your territory. If you got to hold, you didn't have the oil money before it was discovered. If you have to hold off another 20 years and get the right education system, bring up a crop of people to become the next offshore engineers, etc., then do that. Instead of striking these bad deals like that run to almost damn near, forever. Because the people aren't going to see that 12 cents. But if you educate your people and you become a player, right? Just like other small country, Trinidad and stuff, could drill oil and natural gas and stuff like that. You need to become a player. And so that's what needs to happen with a lot of these African countries. You got to stop sitting on your hands and watch the people, right? In fact, use your children, all kinds of stuff. There's videos. You can watch them using children to go dig up these bags of dirt. Mr. Untouchable says, oh, Lord, Koku, don't expose the world to our dumbness. No, I had to say it. You know, I got to say it. You know, we got to do better. Principally, African conceptual frameworks provide a philosophical compass that guides some of the social phenomena facing Africans through their own indigenous knowledges. With respect to development, I contend that African culture is a central domain which holds communities together through principles of a shared ones, social consciousness, and practice reciprocity, reciprocal social relations. George Day, in his book Teaching Africa Towards a Transgressive Pedagogy, takes the definition of culture further as he explicates it as a knowledge system. I'm going to read this quote here from George Day, but I'm going to ask you guys a very important question after. So here's the quote. Thus, every system of thought has its own cultural logic that accords rationality to the knowledge system. All knowledge systems make sense in their cultural context. Thus, it is not a question of whether one's thought process is logical and rational and the other is not. It is a matter of the philosophy of knowledge and what a society decides to accord a premium to in the search of social explanations. This explanation is not simply a relativist stance. It is an acknowledgement of the multiple ways of knowing and the principles behind multiple thought systems. Fictive, metaphysical, and scientific explanations have their own cultural logics and rationality. There is not one form of rationality. Western rationality may be different from indigenous rationality, but each shares ideas and meanings of social phenomena and practice. Indigenous knowledge is the way communities come to understand their world and how we act within such worlds. So the question I want to ask you guys before I continue with the reading, when we talk about, African culture is a central domain, right? Which holds communities together through principles of shared ones, etc. Social consciousness, reciprocal social relationships, etc. My question is that true in light of, is that really true in light of the fact that Africa is dominated by foreign religions? Is African culture really shining through these foreign religions? Are the values, and again, this paper is about indigenous, I get it. But are those indigenous values shining through the foreign economic systems? Are they shining through the foreign religions? Are they shining through the foreign education system? See, that's the question that I think a lot of people ignore. Yeah, there were these indigenous value systems. Then there was domination, and there's still lingering domination. So are these indigenous value systems, this indigenous culture, is this going to shine through when you're still dominated by all these foreign concepts and foreign value systems by way of religion and economics, etc.? The learning curve says we have we have too high of a money consciousness. We want Western comforts today that colonize God knowledge in our minds. She says we get the foreign religions through the legs of non-Africans. we have not learned the lessons of Solomon and all his foreign wives. That's a good point, right? That's actually a good point. Day's suggestion is useful here because he captures how culture within a specific location is conceived of and utilized to explain social realities. In African societies, the idea is how such understandings and knowledges are used to benefit the collective. Within a communal setting, the knowing leads African society to act in accordance with their social responsibility. The driving force behind this mode of development and the spirit of working together is to achieve self-actualization and ultimately self-determination. Surely the question of identity is part and parcel of how one sees oneself in relation to the collective. The strength of these cultural knowledges is in their ability to serve as moral guiding principles that promote social responsibility, collective ethical conduct, and interconnectedness to the well-being of the community. African cultures, in fact, reinforce the prioritization of resource sharing, interdependence, and giving back to society. According to, how do you pronounce this again? It's Sheshe. The psychological well-being, the communal social order is worthwhile. It is impossible for the individual to feel socially insignificant. This system affords the individual the opportunity to make a meaningful life through his or her contributions to the general welfare. And that's really what we miss, by the way. One of the reasons why we opt out, why we're not being competitive, is because we're mired in a system where our efforts really don't go towards our community. So a lot of people just opt out of the shit. You know? A lot of it is just, a lot of folks have just opted out. Those things we have to change. In an African context, the cultural contention creates a space to engage with the question of community, solidarity as part and parcel of one's purpose in life. In essence, this indigenous African way of life enables one to cultivate one's moral character in a society and to rise to the occasion when there is a need. Isn't that missing right here? Isn't this missing from Black society? Right? A moral character, right? To have a moral character that makes one rise to the occasion when there is that need. We don't have such strong group moral character. I want to thank you guys for being here. I'm going to take a station ID break, and then we'll come back and read African Communalism. But before that, Bobby Wright says, I think African traditional culture value systems have been so co-opted, particularly by the Marxist ideology. Yeah, that's a problem too, right? Their economic systems, their religion, etc., even their culture, it's the indigenous value systems are hard to reach, are hard to find. And like the matron said, will ones really want to go back to it? Because people have that taste in their mouth, right? They have that taste in their mouth for Western comforts and everything that comes with it. Their Western religions, Western economies, Western ideologies, Western thinking, etc. Right? Let's do a station ID break. We're going to come back on the other side and continue the paper, starting with this section on African communalism. And this African communalism, by the way, Bobby Wright just mentioned this. He talked about the Marxist ideologies and stuff like that, socialist ideologies. People get that confused with African communalism, right? We'll talk about it on the other side of the break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
Yes, indeed. What are you going to do? Email us if you're interested in joining the network. So we're here at African Communalism. One of the most overlooked aspects of African traditional civil societies is the social safety net that is embedded in African communalism. As stated earlier, the African mode of thought and the notion of community are concepts that encapsulate the social order of Africans. Masol, in 2006, states that ethnographical texts on African societies have sometimes reported African beliefs which appear to confirm this view of community as a natural formation. The author's suggestion is valid, and if we are to truly think about development in an African context, then it must not only be concerned with the philosophical and epistemological communal principles which dictate resource sharing and collective efforts, but also how they will be used in the community. So I talked about those kids digging up dirt that will later be used to extract. Figure it out. Take time and figure the shit out. However, the community has to be seen as an inherent social structure for the African creed. There is a traditional solidarity which must be examined to open up a holistic discussion on the power of the community. For instance, in clan-based communities, where members of a particular ethnic group can trace their lineage to a common ancestor, living in a city, state, or village as a lineage signifies an inherent unity which drives people to function as one body when it comes to preserving the community's resources, especially in times of hardship. See, this is what I think about when I hear lineage, right? You're talking about lineage, but you're not. Anyway, understanding the governing philosophies which permeate African societies is central to understanding how a particular group of people have maintained their way of life throughout the centuries of their existence. Interrogating such knowledges for the purposes of delineating how community functions as an organism that fashions a people's future is essential. I contend that in order to gain a rooted balance and comprehensive perspective on what development looks like from African communal perspectives, we need to understand what constitutes a community. Such a holistic outlook leads to encompassing understanding of the local grassroots works which takes place in Africa and that have been in operation for generations. It also allows one to look at the regimes of social responsibility and elements of social cohesion. Focusing on localities outside of non-governmental organizations and states' structures sheds some light on indigenous communal regimes of social transformation and change, which are the heartbeat of African development. There is a continuous struggle throughout Africa to resist the colonial development agenda while simultaneously honoring the indigenous communal spirits of working in cooperation for the greater betterment of the people. This reality is often ignored. Instead, what we are accustomed to seeing are images of struggling Africans and quote-unquote imperial saviors working with the locals as they highlight the marginal successes and stressing the need to assist Africa without taking any responsibility for how colonialism manifests such deplorable conditions for the Africans and how their works contribute to the colonial project. By the way, he's basically repeating what Walter Rodney has said, right? What is even more troubling to me is that some local Africans have eternalized images of the mighty saviors as great humanitarians. Think the Congo. The great anti-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon long ago asserted that the colonizers have constructed humanity through a highly perverted racist logic, which has been used to spearhead the colonial project. With a gaze on emancipation and freedom, Fanon courageously calls for unity among the colonized in search of freedom and self-fulfillment. Yet Fanon explicitly warned that before the colonized fight the colonizers, they must fight against themselves. Therefore, we must look inwardly, question and reflect on the means of deflecting Eurocentric images and discourses that are ubiquitous in African development. In this process of moving away from the dominant ways of thinking, we ought to recognize the indigenous cultural developmental apparatus that is embedded in the social fabric of the African societies and their power. More important, we need to understand how the indigenousness is operationalized to contribute to human development and growth in all aspects of life. In thinking through ideals of African communalism within the contemporary moment, we must be willing to critically examine the developmental possibilities of such values. Ideologically speaking, engaging with African principles of communalism underscores the need for a dialogue around what the strengths and weaknesses are from an African epistemic understanding. This frame of thinking must encompass philosophical, political, economic, and spiritual dimensions as a way of rethinking local development in Africa. A communal way of thinking must raise new questions about colonial or neo-colonial relations and interrogate Western developmental practices. It must be a paradigm which assists in amplifying African voices as they engage in African affairs. More important, it must be based on notions of an African identity, exemplifying pride and self-determination in resourcefully alleviating some of the hardships of confronting the continent. Imperatively, it must stress the commitment toward working in groups with a strong, historically rooted bond for the well-being of African people. Highlighting this overarching pledge is a key to debunking the myth of Western development in Africa with its masquerading colonial logic. It is essentially a conceptual view that is invested in shedding some light on local efforts undertaken by everyday people in their community as political or social agents and activists. Such perspectives would work to reinforce the societal structures as indigenous organisms of social development. A critical approach connects development in Africa with the question of liberty and self-determination in an anti-colonial struggle, and it calls for a subversion of the colonial order. As stated earlier, this position challenges the Eurocentric humanitarianism. In addition, it makes room for embracing the indigenous as a radical way of transforming society while stressing the importance of African traditions and cultural capital. Let me ask y'all this. Let me just hold this thought for a second. For you guys who are live with me here tonight, again, I appreciate you guys being here. What are some indigenous African concepts that you're aware of that resonates well with you, that guides you in your life and in your life's work? What are some indigenous African concepts that guide you, that resonate well with you and guide you through your life and your life's work? You guys put that in the chat. I'll read them off on air. Therefore, African communities must work with their indigenous ways of knowing to establish stronger spiritual connections within their societies and environments. Such a process would allow community members to self-reflect through their cosmological understandings, thus creating space for one to ponder questions and ask what needs to be done in any community. It also affirms individuals' Africanness by allowing them to self-cultivate their moral, ethical values and act in kind. With that in mind, I call for a radical vision in terms of how we conceptualize development. Who engages in development and how do they go about it? As African communities, we must struggle for a development model that is anchored in our experimental African traditions, values, beliefs, worldviews, and histories. And of course, you know this podcast is a African-centered. This podcast is an African-centered re-Africanization, Pan-African nationalist podcast. To answer my own question that I just asked, one of the things that resonates with me and continues is the idea of Ma'at. The idea of Ma'at is what I try to live up to. The ideals of Ma'at is what I try to live up to every day. Mr. Bobby Wright in the chat says Ubuntu. I like that too. I like that a lot. I like the fact that you use that specific term. The learning curve says I don't have to do everything, but I must do something well. Mr. Untouchable says, man, know thyself. These are the African concepts that guide these folks in the chat. This is why I get along with these folks in the chat, right? You have to, if you're a Black person, you're an African person, you have to have some African ideal that resonates with you, that you try to live up to every day. KW Don 7 dropped another nice one. That's a gem too. All of these guys in the chat are dropping some gems, right? Sankofa, reach back and bring it forward. I mean, that's a great. Ubuntu is great. Sankofa is great. You know, know thyself. Know that you're an African. That's great. You know, making sure that you do something well. That's African. You know, and that's good ideals to try to live up to every day. I forgot who mentioned it recently on social media. It might have been Kamara Sheed or someone like that, who said that you could go months into discourses with people about Africa, African-centeredness, and not hear someone mention Ma'at, not hear someone mention Sankofa, not hear someone mention Ubuntu, etc., etc. That's something that we could change ourselves, right? And we could transmit that to the youth that come up under us, whether it be our children, our nieces, nephews, or just neighborhood kids or whatever. You know, we have to have these terms, these words that came up just now: Ubuntu, Sankofa, Ma'at. Reciprocity is another one. You know, we got to have these kinds of terms being used regularly as African people, if nothing else. So now we are at the implications for education. Within the African context, education is generally concerned with socializing members of a particular group away from their own worldviews. Let me read that again. Within the African context, education is generally concerned with socializing members of a particular group away from their own worldviews. And by the way, this right here is not only a continental African thing. This is a diasporan African thing where, you know, you look at the Caribbean. The Caribbean has had colonizers ranging from the British to the French to the Dutch. And a lot of times the folks who come up in in these colonies, they're concerned with getting to the motherland, and the motherland ain't Africa. The motherland is the Netherlands, it's France, it's the UK. That's because of the education that they receive. At the core of these processes are key philosophical virtues concerning what it means to be a member of that community. Abdi, in 2012, eloquently articulates this notion. He says, the main concerns of the philosophy of education usually looks into issues that pertain to the rationale, as well as the way we educate people, the select learning methodologies we deploy to achieve such education, and the reasons the project is undertaken in the first place. As such, in all the locations where human societies manage their lives, interact with their ecologies, and prepare the situation for future generations, the expansive presence of the fundamental questions of philosophy of education has to be naturally present. I've talked about this again in my own hometown. There was a time, if you're old enough to have gone through it, there was a time when we had this exam. When you were graduating high school, you took this exam in your last year. It's called the GCE exam, right? The General Certificate Examination. And that's a British exam. There's O levels, there's A levels. And if you've ever looked at one of those exam books from it, the way it's written, even some of the references in it, have nothing to do with the people who were taking these exams. Yet this was the standard of education at one point. Later on, they changed it. In fact, in my graduating year in high school, that's when they went to a Bahamian version of that exam that related better to the Bahamian kids, right? There were still big problems with it, but it related somewhat better to the kids. This is what education sets out to do. It distances you from your particular group. It distances you from your worldview. And instead, you look to the colonizer, right? The colonial center is who you look to for everything going forward. To continue. The African scholar's comments offer an encompassing and wide enough framework to engage with the question of education. Pertaining to African indigenous development is a challenge of what kinds of dialogue should surround African education and how such learning processes and practices accommodate indigenous knowledges within the schooling environment. In today's world, where knowledge is synonymous with education, where all aspects of the African indigenous knowledges have been historically constructed as non-scientific and therefore non-valid, we must engage education critically. The Eurocentric classroom is being utilized to fundamentally reshape the world, and it has become a powerful tool to institute notions of modernity and development. Understandably, the colonial classroom, and I like this term, the colonial classroom. The colonial classroom itself is a site of contestation and contradiction that must be interrogated. The task is, how do we engage the classroom as a site of anti-colonial indigenous knowledges? Day courageously calls for an intellectual space wherein multiple knowledges can coexist. Day's ideas offer an important point of departure with respect to development in Africa. The reality is that the Western colonized classroom setting is where development has been spearheaded against the colonized Africans. It is in educational institutions where the African deficiency myths have been constructed, legitimized, and maintained. Moreover, it is where both African and non-African learners become educated in the Western development doctrine. With that in mind, how do we situate our sacred African knowledges in the classroom to ask new questions with the aim of decolonizing development. The centrality of such processes would be knowledge production, validation, and dissemination in and through indigenous perspectives with an eye on the nature of local development. Engaging development in the classroom with an anti-colonial politics creates the space to ask new questions about what local development should look like from multi-centric perspectives. In addition, such an approach would permit educators, learners, and the greater community to take up the African indigenous knowledges and philosophies that have been historically marginalized in the academy as valid bones of living knowledges. Some of the key arguments that would be raised are the following. What African knowledges are you talking about? What knowledges would be included in this model and which ones would be excluded? If African knowledges are capable of contributing to human development, then why is Africa in the state that she is in now? Of course, questions of authenticity would also be raised in terms of what constitutes African knowledges and whether our sacred knowledges are scientific enough. It is clear that such lines of questioning are steeped in colonial ideology, but perhaps answering these questions is something we collectively have to work toward by changing people's mindsets, particularly in terms of how we conceptualize education. For you guys who remember, I did that reading of the book Nation Building, or Kodo, Nation Building. I'm going to link that at the end of this episode. That's something to go back to, right? Indigenizing the classroom with an anti-colonial politics must lead to different educational processes and practices that center African ontological, axiological, and epistemological ways of knowing in students' learning. Indigenous knowledges cannot be engaged with a business as usual attitude because one has to be clear about what politics one brings to the table. Given the relentless opposition to all African knowledges within mainstream society, indigenous ways of knowing must be central to questions of identity, history, and a decolonizing agenda. Decolonization is a historical process which sets out to change the world that can be achieved only through struggle to reject the colonial satiation. Therefore, there has to be radical rethinking of what the classroom should look like, what constitutes knowledge, how do we work with African philosophies as a knowledge base, and what should development education look like in our classrooms. This will not be an easy task because those invested in the colonial project will continue working against anti-colonial education. Let me read that again. This will not be an easy task because those invested in the colonial project will continue working against anti-colonial education. In fact, let me read it one more again. This will not be easy. This will not be an easy task because those invested in the colonial project will continue working against anti-colonial education. Let me tell you something. We've been talking about African-centered education since Carter G. Woodson, if not before. Why hasn't it come really to fruition? And this conversation has been going on in the continent since before Carter G. Woodson. Why hasn't it come to fruition? Because there's those people who are invested, and this is your elites. This is your lawyers, your doctors who've gone to school abroad, or gone to these PWIs or whatever in America for the black. I'm speaking for the black community now in America, right? They've gone to these, Harvards and esteemed to be the first black this and that and the other. These are the people who keep up the colonial project. This is why the efforts for getting African-centered education, ubiquitous. It's so difficult. This is why, and because it's so much work, I always say this, and I stand by it, because there's so much work to be done, this is why it's so hard to get folks to actually jump on the project of anti-colonial education. The learning curve in the chat says, this is 100% true. All organized education, religion, and economy is used to turn you away from African-centeredness. Absolutely. And here's the thing, and D.W.E.B had a spiel the other night on the Shoot the Breeze episode, and I respect it. But what folks don't get, and I get what his ultimate point is too, by the way. I think people might have lost what the ultimate point was. The longer you stay in the vicinity of these people, in the clutches of these folks, the more you're going to be buried by the organized education, religion, and economy. The more you're going to be a part of the colonial project. Listen, even conscious people, even like in fact, let me say this about myself. Even myself, there's things I have to afterwards question myself. Wait, what did I do there? Wait, was that an African-centered approach to that? Was that a Eurocentric thinking in how I did that just now? So even conscious folks, if you're in the belly of the beast, you're going to smell like the belly of the beast. And that's why it's advocated that you get out. Folks in the Caribbean are still influenced by the beast, but they're not necessarily in the belly of the beast, or not as deep in the belly of the beast, however you want to look at it. Folks in the continent are influenced by, but they're not in the belly of the beast. There's a chance there to get this shit up off of you. The stench of a beast. There's a chance. But the longer you stay in it, the more generations you have coming up in it, the worse it's going to be for you. And that's just what it is. And that's where we are. The learning curve says, additionally, some of the best thinkers are invested in the colonial project. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a concept in life. I'm sure you guys have all experienced it. You can walk into a room and it smells stink. But if you put up with it for long enough, it'll get to the point you won't even notice the smell. Here in Brooklyn, there's a train line that runs through Brooklyn called the Q train. There's a nice residential area by that Q train. There's folks who live right next to, they could look in the train. That's how close they live to the track. And you'll talk to them and you'll say, yo, how do you manage this stuff? And they're like, we don't even notice it. And this is the message for even conscious folks who actually understand what's going on. The longer you stay in the beast, the more co-opted you would become. You and all would give rise to helping the colonial project. Bobby Wright says, I'm reading a booklet this week by Baba Ngugi Wa Thiong'o. Oh yeah, okay. Called Decolonizing the Mind. Great. Let me know how it is. Right? Mr. Untouchable says, very difficult to live in a building on fire without coming out smelling like smoke. Absolutely. Absolutely. While I understand we don't need everyone returning, What we really need is people working together holistically, right? But the reality of the reason why people are saying, yo, come out of that beast is because you're starting to smell like a beast. The key question is, how do we make room for African knowledges in our schools? Day argues that this needs to be done through claims of identity, place, and culture. I strongly agree with Day's suggestion for 3 reasons. First, the notion of identity is embodied, therefore, in working Indigenous African knowledges from a developmental stance. One must affirm all the ancestral, experiential, and myth-physical values which are inherently African. Second, the principle of place is one that is rooted in an ancestral homeland located in Africa. For those living in the diaspora in particular, for many generations, this connection could be spiritual, emotional, political, and physical if possible. You see, this is what I'm talking about. When people talk Pan-Africanism, the counter is usually this thing about repatriation. I'm telling you, the first thing you need to do is to repatriate in these manners right here: spiritual, emotional, political, and then physical. Take out the if possible. What I really want to say is that eventually we got to get out of the beast. Eventually, we're gonna have to get out this beast. And those who want to stay, let them perish. Let the beast finish devouring them. This categorization is important because it allows for an assertion of the African identity and a holding on to this Africanness regardless of the colonial realities. The virtue of culture is one that is rooted in the history of anti-colonial struggle, and I am speaking of African cultures as fountainheads of anti-colonial resistance. Revolutionary thinker Amilcar Cabral, one of my favorite Pan-Africanists of Guinea, in his work Return to the Source, eloquently captures the value of culture in people's struggle. The value of culture is an element of resistance to foreign domination, lies in the fact that culture is the rigorous manifestation on the ideological or idealist plane of the physical and the historical realities of the society that is dominated or to be dominated. Culture is simultaneously the fruit of a people's history and a determinant of history by the positive or negative influence which it exerts on the evaluation of relationships between man and his environment. By the way, I recently picked up this book. It's called Ohio Short Histories of Africa. Ohio Short Histories of Africa. And this one is about Amilcar Cabral, nationalist and Pan-Africanist revolutionary, by Peter Karib Mendy. And it's really well done. I really like it. If the book club was still going, I meant to reach out to Carl Hezekiah. If the book club was still going, it would be a great book to read. I don't know if any of you guys have read it. You let me know if you have or not. One of the most important aspects of Cabral's point of engagement with respect to culture is the notion of returning to the source, which I think would be most detrimental to the colonial educational project that masquerades in the name of development. In the classroom, working with the African indigenous cultural knowledges serves as a powerful tool to decolonizing the classroom as we know it. There are going to be many challenges, in my opinion, because indigenous knowledges have not been conceptualized and built for the Eurocentric classroom. But as I stated earlier, if the classroom is a place where knowledge has been shaped and reorganized, then as indigenous African bodies, we must continue working with our ways of knowing with the aim of indigenizing the classroom. We must make the classroom an environment where we think in circles and evoke our ancestral visions as they guide us in our intergenerational anti-colonial resistance. Let me ask you guys something. How would you guys reconstruct the classroom? You know, Mr. Untouchable says, I need to read up on Amilcar Cabral. His name keeps coming up. Yeah. Read Amilcar Cabral. And in fact, I recently watched some videos on YouTube where you actually see him during a time when they were carrying out armed resistance against the Portuguese. Real cool stuff. So look that stuff up. By the way, Bobby E. Wright, I was watching a video with Dr. Bobby E. Wright, and I saw Mr. Bobby E. Wright, who's in the chat now. I saw you commented on that video. That's a really good video. Bobby E. Wright has the humor, has conscious humor akin to like, and delivery akin to like Richard Pryor, which is wild to me. But I mean, it's a shame that brother died young. And the same thing with Emil Cabral. He was taken out young. He was assassinated. You know. So you guys, yeah, look up Emil Cabral. And I'm gonna try to read more stuff from him, because I think one of the things I want to start touching on more is revolutionary thought. Like how Nkrumah had the handbook of revolutionary warfare and stuff like that. I think I want to touch on that a little bit more going forward. So I'm going to try to read a little bit more Emil Cabral as well. Let's continue. In addition, this learning has to be built upon notions of reclaiming the past with a gaze of the future. I contend that education has never been apolitical and or disembodied. Therefore, for African learners, key ideas about African identities have to be broached. Students' embodied knowledges, experiences, and voices must be validated, and they must be spiritually nurtured as African souls. What I'm alluding to are principles of community building, excellence, and achievement for the greater good of the community, and values of reciprocity. These principles are contrary to an individualistic, Eurocentric educational paradigm, and they offer an African epistemological point of departure to rethink education for African bodies. By grounding our education in our sacred knowledges, we not only offer multiple anti-colonial avenues for African learners, educators, and the greater community, but also raise critical questions about the epistemological philosophies that offset some of the contemporary challenges facing African communities. How we collectively choose to meet those hardships is equally important. We have to be clear about what the rights and responsibilities of the community's youth and children are to the collective. In African educational philosophical thoughts, African learners do not learn for the sake of learning, but rather parents, teachers, and the community invest in the students' education with the underlying goal of preparing learners for a better tomorrow. Each indigenous community has distinct values which enable members of that particular group to understand their cosmological world and interpret their social environments. These values are instilled in community members from the time of infancy, and they are groomed through those values in their communities. As stated earlier, the strength of this model is the unity in the collective and how students learn about this solidarity. The collective is a representation of the psyche-cultural values embodied by people and exemplified through their traditions and everyday practices in a search for community well-being. Therefore, we need to rethink and connect notions of development to the community, social structures that are in place throughout the continent to achieve any meaningful development. It is quite clear that the Western development will never develop Africa because it was never intended for Africa in the first place. Let me read that again. It is quite clear that the Western development will never develop Africa because it was never intended for Africa in the first place. You think the education in the Caribbean was intended to develop the Caribbean? No. It was intended to keep the Caribbean a colony for extraction of resources. You think the public school system in America was developed to elevate Africans in America here through enslavement and other means? No. It's meant to keep you as a second-class, bottom caste, quote-unquote, citizen of their nation. With that historical reality in mind, this essay chapter called for an urgent re-engagement with African indigenous sacred knowledges to create new spaces as a means of raising new questions about what development entails. Colonial education has been one of the main institutions in which the Eurocentric prototype of development has devastated Africa. So here, this author shits himself up again, right? He says colonial education has been one of the main institutions in which the Eurocentric prototype of development has devastated Africa. Well, do you think that's by some chance? That can never be by chance. It's intentional. Therefore, any serious engagement of an African-centered development paradigm must first uproot colonial education in Africa. And this is precisely what this chapter has espoused. And that's the end of the chapter, or the end of the reading tonight. I know you guys told me earlier you enjoyed the reading. Those of you who are here with me, those of you who are listening to playback, let me know. Did you enjoy the reading? Right? What, if I may ask those of you who are still here with me live, is there any call to action that this paper has energized within you? Bobby, you're right. You mentioned that you're reading a booklet by Fionga. Can you tell us the name of that booklet? I'd like to check it out. You know, but there's a couple things that was said here by members of the chat based on a question I asked that it's very important. Understand that Ubuntu paradigm. I've done several episodes of the podcast, right, talking about the Ubuntu paradigm. Understand Sankofa, what that really means, right? Bobby Wright says it was informative. Well, that's what I'm here for, right? Re-Africanization content, right? But understand what those things mean. What does Ma'at mean? What does Ma'at mean? How can you use it in your daily lives? Bobby Wright says the pamphlet he's reading is called Decolonizing the Mind. I will look it up. Maybe it's something I discuss on the show. In fact, Decolonizing the Mind might actually be a good Thursday thought show. So thank you for that title, right? Before I go, let me just remind you guys quickly, tune into the Pro-Black Perspective, tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, tune into the Learning Curve, tune in Thursday to the Thursday Thoughts Show. Saturday is where we have fun together with the Shoot the Breeze. Make sure you're tuned into that. Make sure you subscribe to the KWAZ radio channel. The website is almost done. So I'll be letting y'all know about that soon as well. All right. Anyway, y'all, good seeing y'all. Good talking to you. Glad you enjoyed the paper. I'll be back on Thursday on the other channel. On Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll do Shoot the Breeze. If you have topics you want to drop those topics on the Discord. The link is pinned to the top of the chat, down in the description. I'll see you guys on Thursday, hopefully. And we'll definitely chop it up on Saturday. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. I'll see you guys later. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bitamedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Beta Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Beta Medicine Show, Twitter, Beta Meds, Tumblr, Beta Meds, Instagram, Beta Medicine.